Let's take a look at some business news now. And 1/3 of the world's economy could slip into recession this year. Well, so says the head of the International Monetary Fund. Well, speaking to America's CBS News, Kristalina Georgieva fears that the slowdown in China, the world's second biggest economy, could dampen growth in the rest of the world, where more than half of the nations in the European Union could contract in 2023, while the United States might just escape a recession, or courtesy of a red-hot labor market. Well, have a listen to what she had to say.
For most of the world economy, this is going to be a tough year, tougher than the year we leave behind. Why? Because the three big economies, US, EU, China, are all slowing down simultaneously. The US is most resilient. The US may avoid a recession. We see the labor market remaining quite strong. This is, however, a mixed blessing, because if the labor market is very strong, the Fed may have to keep interest rates tighter for longer to bring inflation down. The EU, very severely hit by the war in Ukraine. Half of the European Union will be in recession next year. China is going to slow down this year further. Next year would be a tough year for China.
Well, that was Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, there with that bleak prediction for the world's economy this year. Well, for more on, of course, the global economy, let's now cross live to London, where we're now being joined by Allays business correspondent Laurie Laird. Laurie, Happy New Year to you. And I wish we were starting the new year on a brighter note. But, of course, a grim warning from the International Monetary Fund. Well, the question is, are private economists as pessimistic as Ms. Georgieva there?
That's such a good question, Amika, because Kristalina Georgieva was extremely grim and has become more grim over time. And certainly she gave us a hint that when the IMF comes out with new economic forecast, which is next month, that they will be gloomier than what came before. But one thing to point out is that we've heard economists talking about recession for a number of months now. And part of the reason is because of inflation. Inflation's so much higher than anyone expected. That means central banks have had to raise interest rates very dramatically. That cuts off activity to a certain extent. But none of the forecasts have come true, at least not yet. We have seen so many very grim forecasts. Right now, we're looking at the Chinese yuan. China is where forecasters have been extremely grim. Difficult to assess what's happening in China, because sometimes the economic data out of China can be a little bit suspect. But for Europe and for the US, the data that we have seen have not been quite as gloomy, quite as apocalyptic as people were saying just a couple of months ago. So the data is not proving this recessionary scenario, at least not yet, with the exception of the UK. And hopefully we'll have a few moments to get back to the UK later in our chats.
Well, Laurie, at the end of the day, the IMF was adamant, one part that was quite critical, that central banks need to continue to raise interest rates even as economies slow. Well, what's the reason for that?
The reason is, as I slightly touched upon, is when you have inflation overheating, and inflation in the developed world is as high as it's been since the 1980s. We hit 11% here in the UK, topped 10% in the US, topped 10% in the Eurozone. These are all levels of inflation that few people will remember. I do, because I'm so old, but younger people will not remember a time that inflation was so high. And so the sort of playbook with central banks is that when you see inflation, that means demand is overheating. And so if you make money more expensive by raising interest rates, the people will spend less, and that will cool inflation. So that is the strategy. Whether it will work this time around is very much an open question. And here we're looking at the European Central Bank, which actually had interest rates below zero until very, very recently. They've now raised interest rates by 2 percentage points. But the question is, can higher interest rates pull inflation when inflation to a certain extent comes from an external shock. In this case, it is very, very high energy prices that started because of the war in Ukraine. Prior to that, we did have elevated inflation because supply chains got so snarled up during the COVID epidemic. So it may not be this excess demand that I mentioned that is fueling inflation. It's simply supply shocks fueling inflation. And that means that raising interest rates may not have the desired effect. We are into a whole new ballgame in terms of economics right now. Central bankers are sort of feeling their way, to the extent that Jerome Powell, who is the head of the Federal Reserve in the US, and he's a little bit first amongst equals when it comes to central bankers. Not that long ago, he actually said to a very big gathering, I now understand how much I didn't understand about inflation. So that's a little bit concerning. And it tells you that central bankers are, to a certain extent, learning as they're going through here.
Well, Laurie, will central banks have the nerve to keep lifting the rates even if unemployment rates begins to rise, especially in the UK? And I also want to find out how the markets are really reacting to this announcement by the IMF.
Well, I think this question about whether central bankers will hold their nerve is a very interesting one. Central bankers are much better known than they were back in the 1980s, the last time we saw inflation this high. And I'll talk a little bit about the UK, which, as I mentioned, may well be in recession, or at least economists think so right now. The chief economist at the Bank of England, a man called Hugh Pill, recently told reporters that he doesn't care if he's popular. And what he meant is that he was prepared to raise interest rates as high as they need to go to tame inflation. But the fact that he even said that word popular, the fact that a central banker uses that word, it sounds like a kid in secondary school talking about popularity. And I would venture that if you say that you don't care about popularity, maybe you do. Central bankers now in the public eye, if we do see economies tip into recession, if we do see unemployment start to go higher, will they have the nerve to keep raising interest rates? As I mentioned, inflation close to double digits in so many places. Most big central banks have an inflation target of 2%. So they have a long way to go to bring inflation back to that target.
Well, Laurie, we'll keep an eye out for the markets and, of course, to see how global economies really pick up. Hopefully, this is just Judge Eva's prediction. Hopefully, the markets are better than those predictions from the IMF. Laurie Laird, Allays business correspondent. Thank you there from London.